20 April 1945. 8 meters beneath the ruined gardens of the Reich Chancellery, a birthday is being celebrated that nobody in the room quite believes in. Above ground, Berlin shudders under the opening barrage of a Soviet artillery bombardment that will not properly stop for another 10 days. Below ground, in a corridor lit by bare bulbs and choked with the smell of diesel exhaust and damp concrete, a procession of generals and party officials queues to shake the hand of a man who looks, by every account left behind, 20 years older than his 56 years. His left hand trembles. His eyes are yellowed. He moves like something already half gone. This is Adolf Hitler's final birthday, marked in a bunker he had once insisted was merely a temporary shelter, and which has become, in the space of a few catastrophic months, the last physical space in which the machinery of the Third Reich still pretends to function. The Führer bunker was never meant to be the capital of a collapsing empire. It was meant to be exactly what its name suggests, an air raid shelter, one of thousands scattered beneath German cities by 1945, distinguished only by the address above it. But by the spring of that year, as Soviet forces closed a ring around Berlin that would eventually measure barely a few kilometers across, this cramped complex of reinforced rooms became something else entirely. It became the operational headquarters from which a war was, absurdly, still being directed. Divisions that no longer existed were ordered to counterattack. Reinforcements that had already been destroyed were expected to arrive within hours. Above this warren of concrete rooms, a city of more than 3 million people was being fought over street by street, cellar by cellar, in what would become one of the most concentrated and costly urban battles of the entire war. To understand why matters, and why the story of this bunker still commands attention more than 8 decades later, requires going back rather further than April 1945 itself. By the beginning of that year, Germany's military situation had moved from difficult to arithmetically hopeless. The Red Army had already pushed through Poland and East Prussia over the preceding winter, advancing in places more than 400 kilometers in a matter of weeks. In the West, Allied forces had crossed the Rhine in March, ending any realistic prospect of a two-front war being sustained for much longer. Germany's oil production, its steel output, its capacity to replace lost aircraft and tanks had all fallen to a fraction of what they had been in 1942. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, could barely contest airspace over its own capital. And yet the war continued, sustained less by strategic logic than by a political order that had made surrender, for its senior leadership, functionally unthinkable. The problem facing Berlin's defenders in April 1945 was not merely that they were outnumbered, though they certainly were, facing more than 2.5 million Soviet troops with a garrison that, on paper, never exceeded a few 100,000 men, many of them elderly reservists, wounded soldiers pulled from hospital beds, and boys as young as 12 conscripted into the Volkssturm Home Guard. The deeper problem was that Berlin had almost nothing left to fight with. Ammunition stocks were dwindling by the hour. Fuel for what remained of the city's armor measured in the tens of thousands of liters, not the millions that modern mechanized warfare demanded. Communications between units had begun to collapse entirely, with orders relayed by messenger on bicycles because telephone lines had been severed by shelling. The city's anti-aircraft towers, extraordinary structures of reinforced concrete built earlier in the war, were pressed into service as makeshift fortresses, their thick walls able to withstand direct hits that would have leveled ordinary buildings. But towers, however formidable, cannot substitute for an army. Berlin, in April 1945, was a city being asked to hold an impossible line with almost nothing left to hold it with. It was within this context that the Führer bunker itself took on its outsized historical significance, not because of any startling new technology, but because of what its very existence revealed about the psychology of a regime in its final collapse. The structure had begun life in 1936 as a relatively modest air raid shelter beneath the old Reich Chancellery garden, connected to the Chancellery cellars. As Allied bombing intensified through 1943 and 1944, a second, deeper bunker was constructed roughly beneath the first, engineered by contractors working for the Reich Chancellery's building administration under supervision, that included architect Albert Speer's office, though Speer himself later distanced his own role from the final design. This lower bunker, the one in which Hitler would spend his final weeks, sat around 8.5 meters below ground. Its roof formed from reinforced concrete slabs some 3 meters thick in places, a mass roughly comparable to the weight of a fully loaded articulated lorry pressing down on every square meter of ceiling. The walls were similarly massive, designed to absorb the impact of the heaviest conventional bombs then in Allied use. Inside, the space was startlingly modest for what it represented. A central corridor, perhaps 2 meters wide, ran the length of the complex, with roughly 30 small rooms branching off it, including a map room, a small study, cramped sleeping quarters, and a telephone switchboard manned around the clock. Ventilation was provided by a diesel generator and an air filtration system designed to protect against gas attack, though by April 1945 the diesel supply itself had become precarious, and the air inside was frequently described by those present as stale, thick with cigarette smoke and the particular mustiness of concrete that had never properly dried. Electric light came from the same generator, meaning that during fuel shortages the bunker occasionally slipped into darkness, its occupants working by torchlight or candle in rooms that already felt, by every surviving account, more like a tomb than a headquarters. Construction of the complex had drawn on forced and conscripted labor alongside contracted German firms, a detail that, while less discussed in popular retellings, formed part of the broader pattern of labor exploitation that characterized construction projects across the Reich in this period. Above ground, the battle that this bunker was meant to direct had, by late April, become almost entirely disconnected from the orders being issued within it. Soviet forces under Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev had encircled the city by April 25th, their forces converging from the east, north, and south in a pincer movement that had been planned since the Yalta Conference divided post-war zones of occupation months earlier. Fighting inside the city itself took on a character quite different from the mobile warfare of earlier campaigns. Streets were barricaded with overturned trams and rubble. Soviet infantry, wary of German anti-tank teams armed with Panzerfaust rocket launchers operating from cellar windows and collapsed doorways, learned to advance building by building rather than down open streets, a method that slowed their progress but reduced their casualties considerably compared with earlier, more exposed advances. German defenders, for their part, fought with a mixture of genuine fanaticism, coerced discipline enforced by roaming SS units authorized to execute deserters on sight, and simple desperation, since many understood by this stage that the alternative to fighting was Soviet occupation, and the propaganda around what that would mean, whatever its accuracy, had been thoroughly absorbed. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing but a moment. Specific accounts from the fighting remain patchy, a consequence of the chaos of the final days and the destruction of many unit records, but certain episodes are well documented. The battle for the Reichstag building, fought between April 28th and May 2nd, became one of the most symbolically loaded engagements of the entire war, with Soviet troops fighting room to room against a mixed garrison of SS men, Hitler Youth, and Volkssturm, before raising a flag over the building on April 30th, an image later staged more dramatically for photographers but rooted in a genuine and costly assault. Elsewhere, the fighting around the Anhalter Bahnhof railway station and the Tiergarten Park saw some of the heaviest urban combat, with Soviet tank losses in Berlin's confined streets running considerably higher, proportionally, than in the more open terrain of earlier campaigns, precisely because narrow streets left little room to maneuver away from ambush. Estimates of total casualties during the battle for Berlin, covering the period from mid-April to early May, suggest somewhere in the region of 80,000 Soviet dead and considerably higher German military and civilian losses, though precise figures remain disputed by historians to this day, and record-keeping on the German side had effectively collapsed by the final week. Compared with other fortified command centers of the period, the Führer bunker was, in purely engineering terms, unremarkable. Winston Churchill's cabinet war rooms beneath Whitehall, though shallower and less heavily reinforced, benefited from being constructed and operated in relative safety throughout the war, rather than under direct assault, allowing for a level of organization and functioning communication that Berlin's bunker, in its final weeks, simply could not match. Hitler's earlier headquarters at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia had, if anything, more substantial fortification, with some bunkers there featuring concrete roofs up to 5 meters thick, reflecting a facility built years earlier when resources were still relatively abundant. Soviet equivalents, such as Stalin's command posts, were generally further from the front lines and correspondingly less hardened, since the Soviet leadership rarely found itself needing to work within artillery range of an advancing enemy. What made the Führer bunker historically distinctive was not its construction, but its function in these final weeks. A shrinking, increasingly isolated space from which orders continued to issue, even as the city above it disintegrated. A headquarters that had, in every meaningful sense, outlived the war it was meant to direct. The psychological effect of the bunker's existence, both on those inside it and on the wider narrative of the war's end, proved considerably more significant than anything about its physical construction. For the dwindling circle of officials who remained with Hitler through these final days, the bunker became a sealed environment in which denial could be sustained long after it had become untenable everywhere else, with military briefings continuing to reference divisions and reinforcements that existed only on paper, and the geography of the war reduced, in practice, to a few streets around the Chancellery. Hitler's marriage to Eva Braun on April 29th, conducted in a small room within the complex, and his suicide alongside her the following afternoon, on April 30th, brought this final chapter to its conclusion, with his body and Braun's burned in the Chancellery garden above, a hurried and incomplete cremation owing to the lack of fuel and the ongoing shelling that made a more elaborate disposal impossible. Soviet forces discovered the remains in early May, though confirmation of Hitler's death and the subsequent handling of his remains by Soviet authorities remained subject to considerable secrecy and later speculation for decades afterwards, with Soviet records on the matter only partially declassified long after the war's end. The wider Battle of Berlin concluded with the city's formal surrender on May 2, 1945, a week before the broader German surrender was signed, bringing the war in Europe to its official close. The Führer bunker itself was extensively investigated by Soviet military intelligence in the months that followed, before East German authorities, wary of the site becoming a location of neo-Nazi pilgrimage, undertook efforts to demolish and bury much of the remaining structure during the 1950s and again more thoroughly in the 1980s. Today, the site sits beneath what is now a residential car park and apartment block in central Berlin, marked only by a small, deliberately understated information board, a piece of municipal planning that reflects a broader German approach to sites associated with the regime, one that favors quiet, factual acknowledgement over any form of monument that might invite reverence. Fragments of the bunker's ventilation shaft and some structural elements are believed to remain beneath the modern surface, though the German authorities have consistently resisted excavation or public access, a decision rooted in the same concern that has shaped the site's treatment since 1945. What the story of Berlin's final battle and the bunker beneath it ultimately offers is not a tale of remarkable engineering or military innovation, but something more sobering, a case study in how a regime built on the promise of total control ended in a few damp, overcrowded rooms beneath a burning city, issuing orders to an army that no longer existed. The concrete that once seemed to offer certainty offered, in the end, only delay. The city above fought and died in numbers that remained difficult to fully account for, block by block, cellar by cellar, in a battle whose human cost exceeded that of many entire campaigns fought earlier in the war. And the man at the center of it all, who had once commanded the resources of a continent, ended his war in a room 8.5 meters underground, his authority reduced to a map table and a telephone that increasingly connected to nothing. Return for a moment to that birthday in the bunker, the handshakes, the forced pleasantries, the sound of artillery growing steadily louder through 3 meters of concrete. It is a scene that captures, perhaps better than any battle map or casualty figure, the true character of those final 10 days. An empire that had promised to last 1,000 years, reduced to a handful of rooms, and a fiction that nobody left inside quite had the courage to abandon. Berlin's defenders fought and died for a cause that had already lost the war in every